Okay, I'll get started. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program at Columbia University, and my fine deputy, Daniel Sahansky, is here. We have a really special event today. Ryan Hass, who's a senior fellow and the Armacost chair at the Brookings Institution, is here to speak to us about U.S.-China relations. And we couldn't have a more qualified, up-to-date person to comment on these topics. I wanted to say a few background things about Ryan. He survived working in the Taiwan Coordination Office at the State Department when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary, so he was part of my crew. And you know, when you serve in the government, there's various things you can do well at, or you can cause harm by. But one of the things that people don't pay attention to is personnel. And one of the things I'm most proud of my service at the State Department is that my deputy, Clifford Hart, who was Ryan Hass's boss, and I saw in Ryan tremendous talent, tremendous drive, and a great personality. And we knew that he was going to go far in the Foreign Service. And we thought it would be really great if he worked on China-related issues. But the way the State Department works, you have to be kind of blessed to do that, because they have to invest a lot of time and energy into training you to be in the China cone and the ability to work in country. So you have to convince your superiors. And in this case, Ford and I went upstairs to the 7th floor, and we met with Columbia's own Jack Lew, who became Secretary of Treasury, who was running administration at the State Department at the time. And we told them that we had this very talented guy, and we knew it was very expensive to invest in him to make him a China person in the State Department, but it was really worth it, and there would be high payoff. And Jack Lew agreed. And I recently talked to Jack Lew about that just a couple of years ago, about that experience. He said he knew me from somewhere, and that was how he knew me. And Ryan went on to tremendous success, which is what we expected. And he trained up, and he went out to Embassy Beijing, where he was a political reporter, and he sent cables back to Washington. And for his incredibly good work in Embassy Beijing, he was awarded the Governor's Award, which is, you know, the very top thing you can get as a Foreign Service officer out at post, which is the best cables back to Main State, back to Washington, D.C. from the posts around the world. So think of it as a student. These are the best research papers, the best articles produced anywhere in the world by State Department officials. And Ryan achieved that very high honor after he became a China specialist and went out to post. He then went on to even greater things. He was President Obama's director for China at the National Security Council, where he distinguished himself again. And then after the Obama administration left office, Ryan moved to the Brookings Institution, where he holds his current position. He is an alum of the University of Washington and Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he has a recent book, which I really encourage you to read, which is called Stronger, Adapting America's, I'm reading my own, Adapting America's China Strategy in an Era of Competitive Interdependence. My own handwriting stumped me there, sorry about that. And I really encourage you to read it. It's very informative. It's very well informed because Ryan really knows what he's talking about. We're thrilled to have him. He's a colleague and an old friend, and I'm really grateful to him for taking the time to speak with us today. And I hope you enjoy his talk and engaging with him in the Q&A. Over to you, Ryan.
Well, Tom, it's such a pleasure and privilege for me to be with you, my friend, my boss, my mentor, and everything you've said, I can completely vouch for. My career owes in significant measure to your and Ford's, endorsement and investment in me, and so I'm eternally grateful for your support. I also appreciate the chance to talk with you and other members of this community about where things are in the US-China relationship and where they may be headed. I'm most interested in our conversation, but I understand that my price of admission into it is to offer a few opening comments to help kick off and provoke the discussion. So I will start by trying to situate the moment and then be, irresponsibly speculative in where I see things going. I don't think I'll be making any headlines when I observe that the current state of the US-China relationship is intensely competitive. That much is obvious. But what is less often spelled out is what it is that the United States and China are competing over. At the most fundamental level, from my perspective, I think that both the United States and China believe that their governance and economic models are the best equipped to meet the challenges of the 21st century. I think they both want to benefit from the pull of power that comes from demonstrated success. They both believe that they deserve a prominent leadership role in Asian regional affairs, but also on the world stage. They're both determined to find ways to outpace and outperform the other side. And I think that they both view themselves at a certain level as singular powers in the international system, which is a point that I will return to in a moment. To my mind, these are some of the factors that are baked into the relationship and that represent what the United States and China are competing over. And even as both sides want to outperform the other, I often pause and am a bit confused when I hear people talk about the need for the United States to defeat China or to prevail over China, because I don't entirely understand what that means, but maybe we can get to this in our discussion. But I do know, for example, that there are some grand strategists who wish the United States could replay the Cold War with the United States as the protagonist and China as the state that eventually collapses. I know of many China experts who wish that this outcome could occur, but I'm not aware of too many who expect that this outcome will result from American policy. Similarly, I know of military hawks who wish that the United States could regain its military primacy over China and subdue China's capacity to hold our interests at risk. But again, I'm not aware of many China experts who think that such a scenario is achievable, at least given current fiscal constraints in the United States. I also understand the desire of many advocates of human rights and universal values to try to want to shame China into better behavior by increasing awareness of how they are treating their own citizens at home. But I don't know, frankly, if such an outcome is achievable, particularly when China seems so impervious to outside criticism and when so much of the world has responded to what I consider to be credible reports of large-scale human rights abuses in Xinjiang with the equivalent of a shrug of the shoulders. But however you come out on these questions, I think the underlying point that I'm trying to provide is that there are a lot of constituencies in the United States who have very strong views of China and feel a pressing need to push back or to address the problems that they prioritize with China's conduct. And in addition, I would suggest that there are a couple of other factors that are making this moment in the US-China relationship feel more tense than has been the case in the recent past. The first is that China, by all accounts, has emerged as a truly near-peer competitor. China has cut deeply into our economic advantages. At the start of this century, I think that we had an economy roughly 10 times the size of China's. At the start of the global financial crisis, our economy was 4 times that of China's. Now, depending upon how you measure, economies, I think we're in the ballpark of 25 to 35% larger than China. So there's been a significant reduction in our lead over China in terms of economic weight. And China is no longer a low-end manufacturer. It's now a direct competitor of ours on many technological fields. They have investments and initiatives on every continent, a military that places significant stress upon ours, and growing ambitions to bend rules and norms to suit their preferences. So that's the first factor that is, I think, adding to this intensity around the relationship. The second is that Xi Jinping has imprinted his personality on China's domestic and foreign policy. I remember from my time in Beijing, as recently as 2012, China being committed to reform and opening, to hiding its capabilities and biding its time, like Tao Guangyang Hui. And in practical terms, I think this meant that China sought to avoid unnecessary entanglements, to maintain a benign external environment, and to focus on spurring its own development. That was the guiding principles of China's conduct. Now we see China promoting, domestic economic concepts such as common prosperity or dual circulation, which at their core are intended to reduce dependence on what they refer to as hostile external forces. We see President Xi launching the most ambitious social and economic efforts to wrest control over all aspects of Chinese society that we've seen in a long time. Beijing has shed its modest foreign policy in favor of a proud assertion of China seeking to reclaim its historic position as the leading power in Asia and on the world, and a leading power on the world stage. We've watched China stir the waters, literally, in the South China Sea. They've drawn blood at the Sino-Indian border for the first time in decades. They've absorbed Hong Kong and launched a massive national campaign to tighten control over all aspects of life inside China, none more so vividly than in Xinjiang. They've intensified pressure on Taiwan, as we've read about in the newspaper over the past several days, with a flurry of incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. With the Belt and Road Initiative, they've launched the most ambitious foreign policy program since at least the Marshall Plan. They've adopted a code of never taking a punch without throwing a counterpunch, whether on tariffs, sanctions, or anything else really that Beijing deems as challenging its interest or upsetting its dignity. And so, quite apart from the question of whether China's overall national ambitions have shifted under President Xi, the manner by which they've pursued those ambitions has become much more muscular. And I think that this has caused us to reevaluate some of our assumptions about China's tolerance for risk and friction with us and others in its pursuit of its goals. And at the same time, I think that China's rise has coincided with a period of severe disruption in the United States. As China has brought more of its labor force into direct competition with ours, wage levels in the United States have flatlined. We're going through what I think is often referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. And in practical terms, 30 years ago, the top 10 US companies were all manufacturing giants. Today, they all do digital things. And this is favoring those who make money with their minds over those who work with their hands. We're also going through a demographic transition. And at the same time, we've had a series of what many people feel are setbacks. From September 11th, the global war on terror, the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq, the global financial crisis, the Arab Spring. And all of these events, I think, have intensified this sense of social and political tension in the United States and given rise to partisanship and increased populism. And there's, as a consequence, been a near perfect storm of America feeling hobbled as China appears to be surging forward. And I don't think that this feeling has sat well with most Americans. You know, as we survey the world, we're used to being reminded of our strengths, not our setbacks. And this is, I think, a sentiment that then candidate Donald Trump really seized on when he ran for president the first time in 2016. He blamed weak and feckless policymakers for allowing China to rise at America's expense. And he really sold an attitude, not a strategy. And underlying this attitude was a sense that the missing ingredient for dealing with China was toughness, and that he alone was capable of being tough where others before him had been weak. And that through this toughness, he would put China back in its proper place. And this was, you know, a sentiment that turned into an applause line, which was one of his most dependable applause lines as he ran for president. And at that time, I was working at the White House in the National Security Council, and I remember watching this with amazement, confusion, a bit of trepidation. And after President-elect Trump won the election, I was dispatched along with two colleagues to go to Trump Tower to explain the logic and circumstances of the relationship that they would be inheriting, the US-China relationship on January 20th, 2017. Our instruction wasn't to try to persuade them of anything or sell them on anything, but simply to state the facts so that they would have the benefit of an understanding of the current situation in the relationship when they took office. And we got about 5 minutes into our conversation when the person opposite the table from us basically put his hand up and said that they'd heard enough. And that the problem with you guys, he said, was that you don't understand that we are in a battle for the survival of the existence of the United States as we know it. And if the United States doesn't win and prevail over China, there may not be a United States in 50 years. And I left stunned. But I also knew from that moment that whatever had been taking place before would be different going forward, that the narrative around China would change, and it did. There was a narrative that emerged when President Trump took office that China was on an inexorable rise, that China's rise was a risk to the United States, and then unless China was stopped, America's ability to protect its vision and its values in the international system would be under threat. And these efforts to recast America's views of China got an unusual assist by two former members of the Obama administration, who in the opening months of the Trump administration put out an argument basically suggesting that the past 40 years of American policy toward China had been a failure. So in a matter of months, there was not only a new narrative about the need to counter and suppress China's rise, but one that could be presented as reflecting a bipartisan consensus on China. And as I watched all this unfold, I worried that this new framing of our approach risked miscalculating and misdiagnosing the moment that we were in, and pointing American policy and strategy in a counterproductive direction of being reactive, anxious, and defensive about every Chinese move. And so this was the kernel of the idea for the book that Tom kindly referenced that I recently published, titled Stronger. The book was written in 2019, early 2020, around the time that Joe Biden was campaigning in Iowa. He was fourth, I think, in the Iowa caucuses, third, perhaps, in New Hampshire. So I didn't write the book with any foreknowledge of who was going to win the election. I simply wanted to try to put some ideas on paper for how we could collectively think through where we saw the US-China relationship going. And part of the goal of the book was to try to make a case that the United States remains a stronger power in the United States-China relationship, and that we should act like it. Because at root, I believe that confidence is the wellspring of patience and steadiness. It's what allows us to resist alarmism and instead deal with challenges posed by China with a bit more calm, a bit more steadiness, a bit more farsightedness and cool-headedness. And it allows us to see China as an enduring challenge, not an immediate crisis. And it also, a certain degree of confidence allows us to keep space open for the possibility of the United States and China remaining the two dominant actors in the international system and finding ways, even in spite of their sharp differences, to coexist amidst competition or to find a new equilibrium for managing the relationship. And the more I researched the book, the more confident I became that the United States does have ample reason to have confidence in its relative position in the relationship. The United States is the only country in the world that meets the definition of a global superpower, which is, as I view it, a country with global political and economic interests and the ability to project force into every corner of the world. The United States does have significant advantages in its competition with China. We do have an economy that remains by a fairly significant margin larger than China's. The world's reserve currency, we have food and energy security, benign borders, an alliance network that's the envy of the world, a higher education system that's uncomparable, a culture that attracts the best ideas and brightest minds to want to come to our shores. We have a predictable and transparent legal system, a relatively resilient and adaptable political institutions. China has none of those attributes. And I highlight these facts not to diminish the challenges that China poses to us, which are significant, but to try to challenge our occasional impulses to view China as this 10-foot tall giant that can see into the future and leap over mountains. It's true, China does have considerable strengths, but it also has real vulnerabilities, several of which I will highlight in a moment. But I worry that we've fallen into a trap lately of focusing too much on China's strengths and overlooking some of their weaknesses. And for some in the United States, this is wise and necessary. We should hype the China threat, because just as we defeated totalitarianism and communism in the 20th century, we should use China and the threat of China to mobilize the country, unite the country to overcome authoritarianism in the 21st century. And I understand that impulse, but I think that exaggerating China's strengths and overlooking their weaknesses also carries some risk for us. It's not cost-free. I see a handful of problems with this approach. The first is that projections of insecurity just are not attractive. They're not attractive anymore in countries than they are in individuals. They're not an effective way of pulling other countries closer to us and wanting to work with us and have confidence in us, in our judgment and our views. The second is that appearing reactively anxious sort of validates China's narrative of the United States as an anxious, declining power, doing everything it can to hurt China, to suppress China, to protect its privileged position. And if past is prologue, I worry that hyping the threat from China will invite racism, xenophobia, and real pressure to ramp up defense spending to meet the challenges that we have created or that we see. I think that placing China as the organizing principle of American foreign policy also is an ineffective form of coalition building. There is not the same appetite for great power competition, at least that I have found, in capitals in Europe or Asia that there is in the United States. And from the vantage of many other countries, we're entering an era of acute global challenges, whether it's migration, climate change, pandemic issues, environmental sustainability, energy security, global economic recovery. These are all challenges that touch each of our partners very directly, and none of which can be handled effectively without international coordination. So our fixation on China is ill-suited to the moment for many of our most important partners. But finally, I worry that hyping the challenge that China poses to us beyond recognizable proportions fuels anxiety. Anxiety creates insecurity. Insecurity leads to overreaction, and overreaction generally produces bad policy. So rather than hype the threat from China, my hope is that we can find ways to right-size it. And my general feeling is that China is neither on the precipice of collapse nor on a linear path into perpetuity leading to global domination. I see China more so as an enduring yet constrained competitor. It has a high savings rate. It has the potential to produce more value-added goods, and it still has relatively low per capita income. So China still has room for growth. But when you factor in other variables, I think it's possible to make a case that China's economy already has begun cooling and will continue to do so pretty considerably into the future. And just take stock of the past 8 years or 9 years. Since President Xi entered office, total debt to GDP in China has ballooned. In 2012, it took 6 RMB to produce 1 RMB of output. In 2020, it took almost 10 yuan to produce 1 yuan of output. When President Xi entered office, GDP in China averaged around 10%, 9.6%. Now, in the last quarter before COVID struck, the figure was below 6%. And during this period, total factor productivity has grown basically flat. And the reason for this is that China confronts some pretty significant economic headwinds. It no longer enjoys low-cost production advantages. It no longer can treat air and water as expendable resources. It has a less supportive external environment than it did before. Demographics are already starting to place a drag on growth. And what we're watching with Evergrande is just a powerful example of the debt challenges that exist inside China. Now, some people counter that these headwinds will be offset by productivity gains. And I think that's possible. But to spur productivity, China would need to improve efficiency in the allocation of resources, or further open its markets to foreign competition, or perhaps strengthen intellectual property rights protections. This would require loosening of control, which is hard. In the last 8 years, the pattern that I've watched has been a policy bias towards greater tightening of control rather than loosening. But if China finds a way to maintain stability, state control, and economic dynamism all at the same time, then it deserves our congratulations, because it'll be the first country in human history to do so. But in addition to trying to right-size the challenge, I've also tried to offer perspective on how I see the United States and China relating to each other. In my recent book, I described the relationship as being both competitive and also interdependent, that the United States and China are stuck in this sort of dynamic of competitive interdependence. And this is intended to be a modest departure from the idea of great power competition. But to be clear, I think that competition is at the core of the relationship and will be for a long time to come. After all, the United States and China have different governance models, different economic systems. We have regional and global ambitions that have some tension, and we have fundamental interests that are at odds with each other, whether it's the balance between individual liberties and social stability, or the role of the state in the economy, or just certain issues where we have zero-sum, tension with each other, whether it's in Taiwan or in other parts. So that's real, and I think that competition will be with us for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the United States and China are two large, powerful countries, and I think a case can be made that in terms of overall national power, the United States and China are both separating from the rest of the pack. The gap in national power between the United States and China and every other country in the international system appears to be widening. And at the same time, there remains a very dense web of relationships between the United States and China. Over $700 billion in two-way trade. I think that there are American companies selling into the China market somewhere in the range of $400 billion. There's deep integration of knowledge production between the West Coast of the United States and the East Coast of China. And there's just a simple reality that, that both countries require contributions from the other to address some of the most intractable challenges that we both confront. And so we're both going to be impacted for good or ill by the actions of the other, irrespective of whether we like each other or not. And so seen in this light, where neither side is going to be able to impose its will on the other and both will be impacted by the other's actions, my basic argument is that the United States will do much better by nurturing its own sources of strength and by putting pressure on China to respond to us than vice versa. And the hard reality is that we don't get to choose China's regime type any more than we've been able to choose the regime type in Cuba or Venezuela or Syria or Afghanistan. We don't get to choose the size of China's economy. US strategy is not capable of pushing China back within its borders and having it live in isolation. So part of the work that my book is trying to do is to try to help us concentrate on the things that we can control as opposed to the things we cannot. And our principal competitive advantages are our domestic dynamism, our international alliance network, and our global prestige. We control those things, China doesn't. And the more that we can live our values and tighten our bonds with our allies and galvanize efforts to address global challenges, I think the stronger of a position we'll put ourselves in to compete with China over the long term. And this doesn't mean that we should give China a pass on actions it takes within its borders or be indifferent to those suffering or experiencing abuse, including in Xinjiang. You know, as Americans, we have a long history of standing up and speaking up on behalf of our values and ideals, and I think we should continue to do so. But I do also think that we will put much more pressure on China's actions by improving our own performance and relying on the power of our own example than we will by condemning theirs. But to be clear, even if we do all these things, I don't have any rosy optimism that, that harmony will prevail in the relationship. The truth is that we are locked in a serious competition. And if it's not managed well, it's a competition that holds the risk of conflict. And I've often been asked recently if it's already too late, if both countries have already cast the other as an enemy. And there are certainly constituencies in both countries who believe the other side is a hostile enemy and that we just need to get on with it and work to prevail over the other. But I don't think that these views are decisive at the leader level. As I listen to Xi Jinping speak, I hear him talk about time and momentum being on China's side. But I also hear him warn that the United States is the biggest risk and potential impediment to China achieving its goals. And this suggests to me that China is not seeking a huge confrontation with the United States. It recognizes its vulnerabilities in the event of a direct conflict with the United States. Now, an argument can certainly be made that China's actions are inviting confrontation, but I don't think that is their plan, and I don't think that's their interpretation of their own actions. Similarly, President Biden, I don't think, is looking for a cosmic clash with China. When he called Xi Jinping last month, he talked about the need to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict. And the hard reality is that neither side can escape this relationship. Neither sees direct conflict as a path toward achieving their own national ambitions. Neither country's population is clamoring for a conflict with the other. So I don't think it's too late. But at the same time, I don't think we can afford to ignore the risk or take them lightly about tripping into conflict. And I hope it doesn't take another Cuban Missile Crisis like it did during the Cold War to really concentrate minds in Washington and Beijing on the need for managing competing interests and objectives. In addition to fortifying our crisis communication and risk management mechanisms, I think there are a few other ingredients that we'll probably need to work on in the coming years. The first is the United States is going to need to accept that China has legitimate interests around the world and that China is not going away. In most regions of the world, China will be the most capable actor alongside of us. China's presence around the world is likely to grow, not recede, in the coming years. They're not going to retreat behind their borders. And while some of China's actions do directly challenge our interests, not all of them do. And we're going to need to find ways to differentiate between those actions that implicate our vital interests and must be countered versus those that do not. Because challenging every Chinese action everywhere in every instance is not an effective use of our national resources, and it's not going to help us to build coalition efforts with other countries to deal with some of the challenges that China poses. Second, I think that we're going to need to accept the need to communicate directly with each other. Direct interaction between Washington and Beijing has grown a bit out of favor in recent years. There's a widespread view in Washington, at least, that Beijing likes to tie the United States down in endless dialogues while it pursues its objectives in other areas. And while I agree that the United States should never enter dialogue for the sake of dialogue, and that our interaction should be purposeful and interest-driven, I'm also of a strong view that there is no substitute for dealing directly with the Chinese. We don't have to like each other to talk with each other. We just need to recognize that it's in our interest to be able to signal clearly what our intentions are and to clarify the objectives of their actions. Less miscommunication creates space for miscalculation. And the third thing that I think that we're probably going to have to do is to restore a bit of discipline in how we handle Taiwan issues. There is a view that is being taken seriously in some quarters that the United States and China sooner or later are going to find themselves in conflict over Taiwan. So we might as well do everything we can now to prepare for that war to win it. And while I understand the logic, I worry that such thinking is irresponsible. It treats the 23 million people of Taiwan as not having agency in their own future, as just being objects of US-China rivalry. It compels us to take actions that could precipitate the very outcomes that our strategy is designed to prevent. I think it takes casually the fact that any war in the Taiwan Strait involving the United States and China would be the first war in human history that involves significant high-end cyber, space, long-range strike, and nuclear capable countries. And it's not very mindful of the history of the past 40 years. Where in spite of our significant differences, the United States and China and Taiwan have found ways to manage tensions without resort to force. So to be clear, I think that the risks in the Taiwan Strait are significant, but at the same time, conflict is far from inevitable. And we owe it to our people, to our friends in Taiwan, and to the world to do everything possible to keep it that way. So I'm going to wrap up because I'm very eager to join our conversation, but just in closing, I think that, we are asking the United States and China to do something that neither country has history of doing. China has no precedent of viewing itself as a co-equal with another major power in the world. The United States has no experience dealing with a country of comparable size, reach, and economic weight who has a different governance model. So it's not going to be easy for either country to find an equilibrium for managing the relationship. It'll likely be a period of years or longer as we navigate heightened tensions in search of this equilibrium. But ultimately, the core of the argument that I'm trying to leave you with is that it's in our interest to find ways to push the relationship in the direction of a long-term competitive coexistence. We can best strengthen our own competitiveness by investing in our strengths, our dynamism, our alliance network, and our international prestige. We don't need to defeat or destroy China to protect ourselves. We need to deliver the goods for our people, live up to our values, and lead international efforts to address global challenges. And if we do those things, I'm confident we'll be just fine in our ability to compete with China. But with that, Tom, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. It was a scintillating talk, very comprehensive and great analysis. And I just wanted to ask you about that moment. The Trump campaign won the election. They took office, and then you had Foreign Affairs article by two future members of the Obama team, Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi, saying that engagement, as they described it, and 40 years of policy towards China needed to be fundamentally rethought. They called it a reckoning, as I recall. So you had a kind of bipartisan consensus. Now, a lot of my students are in the group here, so they've probably heard me say this before, that I think by historical standards, US-China policy and US policy in Asia in general from the late 70s to the present has been, by historical standards, fantastically successful in that we've had no major interstate conflict. We've had lots of wealth production. We have a sustainment of forward deployed US forces and allies and partners, and a very strong diplomatic presence. But it has been declared a failure. And I wanted to push you on that and talk about this idea of confidence. One of the manifestations of this analysis that you call a bipartisan consensus is that engagement was the problem and engagement is dead. And that has been stated more recently than the Foreign Affairs article. Engagement is dead. But of course, we have to engage China for the reasons you cited. You know, we have non-proliferation concerns, we have climate change concerns, financial stability concerns, counterterrorism concerns. But you have to deal with China. It's a major global actor. You don't really have much choice, so you have to engage. So the new diplomatic language is, we'll engage China, but only from a position of strength, right? So that's a constant mantra now. And I wanted you to comment on that as a diplomat. Like, how do you go into meetings with a country where you're saying, I'm going in from a position of strength, I've got a big stick in my hand. Is that a good diplomatic strategy? Is that really designed for domestic audiences to say, yeah, we're engaging China, but we're not like those other guys in the past? And then on alliances, it seems to me that I think you hit the nail on the head that portraying things as a kind of struggle against China and having it as a center of US strategy is not necessarily embraced by the allies and partners who provide us a great strategic advantage over China in any kind of competition. But if you state it boldly and publicly, you might alienate those same allies and partners, it seems to me. So that piece seems like questionable diplomacy. And then the third piece of questionable diplomacy, where I've been critical of the current administration, is the notion that success can be measured by how China reacts to our policies in a way that hurts China's own interests. So I've seen press conferences by unnamed senior officials in which they said, well, we didn't get what we wanted in the meeting, but we got China to react to what we said at the meeting in such a way as to undercut China's own diplomatic portfolio in the region and to alienate others, which is in our strategic advantage. Those are the three pieces of diplomacy that strike me as very different from what we were doing in the past. Whereas your prescriptions seem consistent, and I think they're very wise prescriptions, consistent with the basic policy before, in that engagement was never lacking in competition, and it was never lacking in criticism and pushback on various issues, including Taiwan. But if we declare it all as a failure, and we declare that the only thing that counts as success is if we posture strong or get China to make mistakes, then I think we're probably heading in the path that you worry about. So that's partial speech, partial question, and I'll leave it back to you. And for the other people who are using the Q&A function, you need to identify yourself and your affiliation for us to handle your question, because that's what we do in person when we are lucky enough to meet in person, which I hope we'll be able to do again. Okay, over to you, Ryan.
Well, thank you, Tom, for your observations. It won't come as a surprise to you that I broadly share your views. I think that the past 40 years of Asia policy for the United States were tremendously successful. They helped usher in a long peace in Asia that served America's interests extremely well. There hasn't really been a shot fired in anger for a long time, with the exception of the sticks being wielded at the Sino-Indian border last year. There's been incredible economic growth. The rights of citizens in many parts of the region have improved. The lives of people throughout the region have improved. These are things that we should be proud of, and we should try to continue. I don't understand entirely what it is that is such a failure that compels us to throw everything out the window in search for a radically new, different approach, other than in a discomfort with the idea that China has grown more powerful. And somehow that is our choice and our decisions that enabled or allowed China to grow powerful, and it was a mistake. My view is that it takes a pretty high degree of arrogance to think that the United States is what allowed China's rise. And it had nothing to do with the fact that 1.4 billion hardworking people, representing 1 out of every 5 human beings on this earth, situated at the heart of the most dynamic economic region of the world, had something to do with it. So yes, the fact that we were willing to engage with the Chinese, the fact that we didn't violently oppose their economic development, I guess you could say, was a form of tacit acceptance of their rise. But I'm not sure that it was our decision to make. And I think that it's a misdiagnosis to think that that the fact that China is more powerful today than it was 40 years ago represents a failure of American policy or imagination. The notion of engaging China from a position of strength is something that gets repeated over and over again. And every time it does, I cringe as a former diplomat because I can't think of a less effective way of entering a discussion where you intend to try to achieve something than by walking into it saying, you know, we're bigger than you are, accept us, and then expecting the Chinese to react constructively to what it is that we're asking of them. I mean, part of the problem that I think we've had over the past 4 or 5 years is there's no incentive for the Chinese to act in a moderate way. And to be clear, I don't blame the United States. It's China's own behavior, its own decisions that have created, I think, a disproportionate amount of tension in the relationship, their own impatience and assertiveness. But I don't think that we've handled our half of the equation terribly well either. And I would like for us to move beyond talking repeatedly about entering from a position of strength to just accepting that we're strong. We should have confidence in our strength. Where I grew up, if you have to tell someone you're strong, you think of yourself as pretty weak. That's not how you instill confidence in others, by saying I'm really strong. And so I hope that we can just move past this with time. The other thing I hope we can do is move past this idea of training the Chinese to accept a new framework for the relationship. You train your dog to do things. You don't train the second largest power in the world to do things. And it's just, it's a tone deaf expression. I understand what it means. It means trying to condition the relationship to a new balance. But it's not something that any trained diplomat would naturally say. And then finally, on your observation about us taking credit for the Chinese acting in ways that induce self-harm, it's a symptom of the same sort of mindset, which is that every Chinese failure equates to an American success. And as long as we hold that view, I think we're going to struggle to make progress in this relationship. And I hear people sometimes counter that, look, the Chinese view us as enemies, so why don't we, it's fair is fair, we should treat them as enemies as well. And I guess my reaction, Tom, to that is that, this isn't a schoolyard code where you dislike someone because they dislike you. Our job is to advance America's national interest. Mm-hmm. And I'm yet to be persuaded that our interests are advanced by sort of having that mindset or approach to the relationship.
Thanks a lot. I'll let others handle some questions. Maybe I'll chime in again, in a bit. So, Daniel, why don't you take over on the reading of questions?
Sure. I'll pitch a couple questions from the audience to you, Ryan. Just with a preface that Ryan is obviously not representing the U.S. government, and is that's past affiliation. So, any questions about current strategy and policy has nothing to do. They don't overlap. First question from Malika Robinson, who is actually a PhD candidate at SOAS, is curious. They saw an event this morning on CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where the U.S. Trade Representative Tai suggested that the Biden administration will enforce the phase one trade agreement. And their question is that, is the administration committing a strategic error by following the Trump playbook regarding tariffs and other strategies in general? They were curious what your thought might be on this.
Well, I appreciate your disclaimer, Daniel. But I'm sympathetic to the fact that the Biden administration inherited a tough hand, and that some of the work of rebuilding will have to be done sequentially, where we invest first at home and then build out from there. But I'm a bit uncomfortable with slogans taking the place of strategy, and I worry that we're sort of falling into that trap a little bit. I don't know what a foreign policy for the middle class is or what it means. It feels a bit like a bumper sticker, sort of like great power competition is as well in my mind. I think that, it troubles me a little bit that the Biden administration acknowledges that that tariffs are creating harm for American workers. Secretary Yellen has said this publicly, but we don't seem willing or able to lift them. And I understand that, the political constraints that policymakers are working under, but I think that one of the lessons that our friends in Beijing take away is that the Biden administration is being reactive. They're not creating the climate, they're responding to it and dealing with the climate that's being imposed upon them, which is not, I think, a indication of strength or an expression of strength. There's also just sort of a jumble of contradictions that are evident. We talk about being prepared to work with and talk with Chinese economic officials, but then in the next breath say we don't expect it to achieve anything. We talk about wanting to coordinate with allies and partners, but are unwilling to engage in any talks leading to free trade agreements, which would be the natural vehicle to align such efforts. And, we risk sort of overestimating our own competitiveness in Asia, sort of commending ourselves for our work and strengthening our security posture, when a lot of the game that is taking place in Asia right now is an economic game. And so I guess that's my broad reactions to the speech. I understand where it's coming from. I hope that it can be improved upon going forward.
Very much understandable. The next question comes, and I apologize once again, I should have started with this if I'm going to butcher anyone's name ahead of time, so bear with me. This comes from Nason Mayabui, who is the research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. And they ask, my perception is we are starting to see the outline of a Biden-China policy marked by aggressive rhetoric, but conciliatory action. Do you share that perception? And if so, do you think that's a conscious dual track strategy with a view towards different audiences? Or is it more the consequence of lots of cooks in the kitchen?
Well, Nason always asks tough questions. Today is no different. The honest answer is I don't know. But aggressive rhetoric and conciliatory action. I think that, there is a sharpness to the rhetoric. I'm not sure that the actions themselves have been terribly conciliatory, nor has China taken any actions that would merit a conciliatory response. But, with the return of the two Michaels and Meng and the American citizens who were being prevented from departing China in the recent week or weeks, I'm hoping that that is a small step towards resumption of a more professionalized effort at sort of solving problems step by step, piece by piece, working from smaller problems to bigger problems, and that over time we can begin to find a new balance for the relationship.
Next question comes from a Nicholas Reinhold, who is a current U.S. Air Force reservist and an alumni of SEPA, who asks, do you see China reversing current trends limiting freedom of speech domestically, even on digital platforms like WeChat, and especially regarding core issues? And how can U.S. officials engage with counterparts whose views are shaped and influenced by an environment that limits open discussion on sensitive issues?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I hope that Tom will weigh in with his own experiences. The situation that Nicholas described, I think, is true, but it's not new. This has been what we've been dealing with from the very start. There's never been any doubt in anyone's mind that I'm aware of that the counterparts that we were interacting with were believers in the Chinese Communist Party and in what it represented. And so I think that the situation inside China has grown more acute in recent years. There has been an intensity to efforts to assert greater control over Chinese society, and that's troubling. But the underlying dynamic that I think Nicholas is asking about is not a new one. But Tom, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I don't think it's a new one, but I think that particularly Chinese diplomats are more worldly than some of their publications might suggest in terms of the ideas that they're exposed to and the criticisms of China that they hear. They may not agree with them, but they hear them. So I have never really felt that one of the problems in U.S.-China relations is that our diplomatic counterparts were not highly professional or not knowledgeable. I've always felt like the problems were much more related to the very tight tether that holds them in place in the discussions, not their ability to think outside of the propaganda lines. That might change over time if the process that Ryan described so well, where Xi Jinping is controlling thought much more proactively than previous Chinese leaders, and actually, training them in political sessions on a regular basis. But in my experience, the Chinese diplomatic corps is worldly, highly educated, and highly professional. They're just highly constrained by the environment in which they work. Would you agree with that, Ryan?
Yeah, I would. I think it's a good way of describing it. It's worth bearing in mind that the Chinese diplomats, it's an incredibly rigorous process to be selected as a Chinese diplomat. Competing against 1.4 billion people for a very small number of slots that are pretty well regarded in Chinese society. I mean, they bestow a lot of social credibility inside China. And these are the best of the best in China's system. And in closed doors, they are facile. They understand how they're perceived abroad. And there is a certain performative nature to their work to please their masters in Beijing, which is unfortunate for diplomacy. But they're also, highly adaptive and capable of thinking through issues when they're given the mandate or the space to do so.
Almost the opposite of the going from an academia. I'm the amateur here, I would recognize that with them, which they seem to. But yeah, I always thought that they were skilled people. Their language skills often are very good in multiple languages. Many of our own diplomats are that way. So that's not really the problem. It's really a political control problem, and it may become a problem if Chinese news and what even Chinese elites are exposed to because of censorship and control actually limits their knowledge base. But I didn't see that as the primary problem 12 years ago or 13 years ago, and I don't think it's been the problem since.
Tom, just to know, we're getting messages on our end that you have really low bandwidth, so I don't know if you have anything you can do to increase your internet. You've cut out one or two times during your last speech. Just wanted to make sure you were aware.
Yeah, there is. So I will move and I will put my professional picture back up.
In the meantime, I will go on to the next question, which is from a Karen Zhu, who's a PhD candidate at the Party Rand Graduate School, and as well as an assistant researcher at the Rand Corporation, who asks, you mentioned a narrative tipping point in 2016 that triggered a drastic turn in U.S. foreign policy stance towards China. Do you see another turning point for the change in the China narrative for the U.S. foreign policy community in the near future? If so, what would that moment look like potentially, domestically and internationally? What are some conditions that need to be met to reach that turning point?
Daniel, it's a really good question. I think that President Trump and his team, they felt a mandate to really shake things up and do things pretty significantly differently than had been done in the past. And so that was a pretty sharp departure point. It's going to be hard to replicate in sort of the degree of the turn that takes place on a sudden basis. But I think that we've already begun to see sort of a gradual incremental turning of the giant ship of state that is the United States government. If you think back to the speech that Secretary Blinken gave at the start of his term, where he talked about the Biden administration's 8 foreign policy priorities. One of them was China, but there were also 7 other global priorities, ranging from climate change to pandemic response to global economic recovery and other issues. So there's an effort to sort of situate China within a broader global construct rather than have China be the sole animating focus of America's foreign policy. So I think that represents a process of a gradual evolution in the way that we talk about China and the United States. We'll have to wait to see what the national defense strategy and the national security strategy that the Biden White House and Biden Pentagon will put out in the coming months says. That will be, I think, the next sort of major data point for measuring sort of the direction that the narrative, at least at the official level, is going. And oftentimes, the broad narrative is heavily influenced by the views of those in senior positions in government. So that will be a space to watch, I think.
Of course. Our next question comes from a longtime friend of the program, TK Chu, over when the program was based at Princeton. But switching topics a little bit back to conversations potentially about Uyghurs. And I apologize if I don't get all of the nuances of their question, but essentially the question has to do with what leaders from China and the United States, Biden and Xi Jinping, might be able to do to, if not solve, at least minimize tensions or potential clashes regarding issues surrounding the Uyghur and Xinjiang issues in general, to potentially get to a more acceptable state, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really hard issue. I'm hoping that Tom will help me out on this. The hard reality is that that not every problem in the world has an American solution, and it's not something that we're accustomed to accepting or acknowledging. But I think it's a fact. When I served in the embassy in Beijing for 4 years, part of my account was being the Xinjiang reporting officer. So I had an opportunity to travel out to the region on about a quarterly basis and travel all over the region, meet a lot of different people. And, what I've watched in recent years has broken my heart, just to see the brutality that's been on display. So I'm not indifferent to what's going on. I think one of the things that we can and should do is to try to keep as unblinking of an eye as possible on developments in Xinjiang, so that it's widely known that the world, or at least America, is watching what is happening. It's important for us to raise this issue as an issue of concern at every level. If only the ambassador is raising it or the assistant secretary, it's going to be treated a lot differently than if every level from the president on down is raising it in his or her interactions with their counterparts. To the extent that we can, I think it's helpful for us to try to encourage a bit of a chorus effect so that both we and our like-minded partners are raising similar concerns. But I think it's also important for us to develop some very specific concrete asks of what it is that we would like to see happen to begin to address the concerns we have about developments in Xinjiang. To date, I think that we've probably done a lot to raise awareness around the world of the issue, but not a lot to put sort of specific asks that are concrete on the table about what it is that we want to see happen. And doing that also has the corollary effect of helping the people in Xinjiang know that we see them and that we support them in every way that we can. So those are a few of the ideas I would put on the table, but I welcome Tom to build on.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. It's the Chinese Communist Party has a long history of repression against its own citizens, and I have to say that it doesn't shock me when I see suppression of free thought, of any kind of pro-democracy expressions, prison sentences for dissidents, all things that Americans, by our value system, are opposed to, and I think quite rightly raise as objectionable in our discussions with our Chinese counterparts, who almost always say, this isn't your business, this is our internal affairs. But on certain occasions, the Chinese Communist Party actually surprises me. And I have to say that the degree and scope of the repression in Xinjiang has been very surprising to me. I didn't expect them to do something so systematic and so large against an entire ethnic population, as seems to be the case in Xinjiang today. So I think it has to be an issue to be raised by U.S. officials, by society members, non-government organizations as well. And I think it's something that U.S. diplomats should raise in third countries to try to get shoulder to shoulder with other countries, especially Muslim majority countries. I've been rather disappointed. I traveled in Southeast Asia in the last months when you could do that before the pandemic, and I stated it in public statements that it was really disappointing that Malaysia, Indonesia haven't taken a tougher stance against what seems to me a largely religious-based repression of a minority group. Now, all that said, it's better to go in from an American perspective on human rights questions with others beside you, not because you're going from a position of strength, but because you're going from a moral position that is not necessarily linked in the Chinese mind to containment and great power politics. So when we engaged the Chinese in the human rights dialogue in the spring of 2008, it was good to have, Holland on board with our statements. Why? Because no one thinks that Holland, no one thinks the Netherlands is trying to contain China. No one thinks that Denmark is trying to contain China. No one thinks that Norway is trying to contain China. And it was laughable when Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Prize and Beijing said, Norway's trying to contain China. It's just not going to happen. So it removes that possibility, and it makes it about the morals. Now, on the other side, though, TK, and it's great to have you back and engaged here with us, I'm opposed to the language that the United States government has used about Xinjiang. The Trump administration labeled this a genocide, and the Biden administration, either for sincere intellectual reasons or for domestic political reasons, has stuck with that label. And I think it's an inaccurate label. I have said publicly, I'll say it here, I consider it a crime against humanity to round up large groups of young people and put them through re-education or brainwashing for a year to try to get them in line with the political views of the capital. But it's not a genocide. Fortunately, in history, genocides are rare. And this doesn't seem to fit that description. Now, why is it consequential? It's consequential, ironically, because I think it provides the Chinese Communist Party a good response to the criticism that actually works in their favor. They're able to say internationally that the United States is exaggerating conditions in Xinjiang, and that is because the United States wishes China ill. And I think if we describe the situation in Xinjiang more accurately and avoid the excessive descriptions of what's happening in Xinjiang as a genocide, we'd be in a better position to counter that Chinese defense. So I think we've provided Beijing for what are really horrendous policies, and it breaks my heart too. I spent a little time out there back when I was a grad student, and it's just it's not just an internal affair either, in that it violates China's own commitments to human rights, its own human rights commitments on the international stage. This is not okay. And I would hope that that kind of approach would maybe lead to some change in China, but I don't think the terminology that we've used has been helpful.
Somewhat in the same thread to that, we got another question from another longtime friend of the program, Yen Bennett, who is runs the Center on Contemporary China over at Princeton University, who wanted to ask both of you, what would the approach to address the human rights violations within China's borders, its aggressions in the South China Sea, cyber crimes, and it's allegedly towards other government offices, etc. Not yet. How does this is a very complicated question. I apologize. Can you speak to the general human rights issues, including things that would be fostering xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiment? And then she follows it up by saying, for me, Trump was clearly racist and made racist statements like the Kung flu and so on, but foreign policy statements being made by Congress and the State Department about human rights violations are not. I don't think we need to develop the notion that saying anything negative about China is racist and xenophobic, but there has to be some sort of common ground. If we can speak to that, or anything else that makes sense to sort of bridge, similar to what TK was asking, how we can find some common ground on some of these very complicated, larger issues.
Well, Daniel, I think it's a fair and valuable point. My reaction is that when we speak about issues that we're concerned about, we need to speak about it with specificity and concreteness. When we talk about the Chinese are, all evil, the Chinese are trying to impose COVID upon the American people, these broad brush sweeping statements are what are invitations to xenophobia and racism. When we talk about very specific issues that we have deep concerns about that violate our values, then I think that we're on much more solid ground. And to Tom's point, we need to, be mindful not to do China's work for them. Their default is to suggest that it's just the Americans, they wish us ill, they're trying to suppress our rise because they're in anxious declining power. We need to provide very, concrete, specific reasons why we have bases of concern. And that provides, I think, the strongest foundation for us to be able to attract others to stand alongside us in registering their own similar concerns. One of the things that I've, taken away from my time interacting with the Chinese on these issues is that when we are able to raise concerns both privately and publicly, and also bilaterally and in coordination with other allies and partners, it has much deeper resonance than if we only check one of the boxes in that quadrant. And the best way for us to be able to check all four of those boxes, private, public, bilateral, and in coordination with allies, is to do so in a manner that is defensible, that's analytically rigorous, and that can hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah, and I would add another thing, which is I think we need to move. Ryan and I had a conversation early on in the first part of the Q&A period about how the U.S. should be pitching its strategy towards China in its discussion of U.S.-China relations. And I think it's often useful to state things out of sadness rather than anger, that it's not good for the United States, for China, the Chinese government, to be harming its international reputation by repressing its own people. And it would be a better world if China's reputation was somewhat better and it didn't repress the people in Xinjiang. So if you're really in a kind of zero-sum struggle and you want China's reputation to be hurt, you might even celebrate the repression in Xinjiang because it provides you an opportunity to report that repression and make the Chinese government look bad. If you see things in a less zero-sum fashion and your goal is really to shape China's behavior so that it uses its growing influence in the world for a positive end rather than a negative end, then you would celebrate China actually improving its diplomatic relations, its diplomatic reputation by improving its behavior at home. And that would be a win-win outcome. But you have to think in terms of win-win outcomes in that case. And otherwise, it gets caught up in this the zero-sum struggle. And unfortunately, as Ryan backed me up on this point, which is then it starts to look like it's part of geostrategic competition, not part of pushing American values. And the reason we're upset about Xinjiang is not geostrategic competition. We're upset because a very large group of people is being treated in a terrible fashion, totally unjustifiable, in violation of Chinese government agreements with the international community on human rights. And it's very clear. And we shouldn't exaggerate it. We shouldn't celebrate it. We should try to change it to the degree we can. But I think Ryan's point about humility is important, that there's a limit to how much the United States can actually achieve on that score.
Switching to an easier topic, there's been a couple questions about Taiwan. I believe one of your students, Francisco Martinez, who's a SIPA alumni, Tom, as well as Patricio Figueroa, who is the managing director or director of the World Dermatology Institute, have both asked questions about Taiwan. Francisco's question is, we have seen increasing coercion from China against Taiwan, and at the same time, the US has strongly supported Taiwan integrity. However, the US always tries to work with alliances, specifically now with the Quad and the AU-KUS. What other things could the US do to be more explicit regarding the shared value-minded countries to show support for Taiwan? Would that mean a trigger for the CCP to behave more assertively? And just to round it out, the question specifically from Patricio was, what might happen or what might stance the US might take if China were to attack, potentially invade Taiwan? So I gave you guys a lot, but.
Well, Ryan is now the head of Taiwan studies at Brookings, and he's inherited the position of the estimable Richard Bush, who's a mentor of mine and a friend. And I'm going to turn it over to the inheritor of that chair to start us off.
Well, it's an important question, and one that we need to really wrestle with, I think. I agree with the underlying premise that that Beijing's pressure on Taiwan is intensifying. I'm not sure if that means that it's going to intensify on a linear trajectory towards, kinetic invasion of Taiwan. I'm not sure if that's the plan, but it's not something that we can rule out either, and we have to be prepared to deal with. I think that there's a lot that the United States can do with other friends and partners to demonstrate support for Taiwan in their own interests, not in opposition to China. The first thing is to sort of separate our appetite for great power competition from our support from Taiwan. I don't think it serves Taiwan's interest to be used as a tool to poke and prod China in most uncomfortable places. I think when we do things with Taiwan, we need to be able to do them because it's in our interest and it's in their interest to do so. And it needs to be done in a coordinated fashion where we're both bought into it. I think that with our European friends, we've already seen a fair bit of movement in terms of their support for Taiwan over recent years. And there's good reason for it because there's shared values that bind Taiwan and the EU. There's significant investment by the EU. The stock of investment from EU countries is the largest stock of investment in Taiwan of any body. But there are also geostrategic reasons as well. The fact that Taiwan plays such a central role in global supply chains, I think, is a fact that's not lost upon our friends in other regions of the world. So I think there's a lot of space for us to work together on supply chain security in ways that are inclusive of Taiwan. I think on values issues, that Taiwan is a success story. It's a consolidated democracy that is working hard every day to improve its own situation at home. And they have lessons that can be shared with others that are following down a similar path, and we should encourage and support that. And then I think that there are ways for us and some of our partners to align efforts. So for example, after COVID, when the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services signed a MOU with his Taiwan counterpart on public health cooperation, there should be ways to, replicate that type of agreement with other partners who would have a similar shared interest in working with Taiwan on these issues as well. And so those are just a few ideas off the top of my head that I'm sure Tom can build upon.
Yeah, I would add a couple. It's unfortunate for the reasons that Ryan said, that the United States has, in a bipartisan way, turned away from international trade agreements. And that's harmed us in our competition with China because China has embraced them. They've joined the RCEP with 40 countries, and now they've applied to get into the CPTPP, the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was something that they were initially not part of, and now they're trying to become part of it. And the United States doesn't show any interest in getting involved in that economic gain. And one of the areas where the United States can support Taiwan is through economic agreements. We've always pursued them in the past, and we should pursue them in the future. But economic agreements right now in American domestic politics are not very popular. And I find that perhaps the greatest source of America's own self-weakening, to use the metrics that Ryan is talking about, is that we seem afraid of international economic engagement when we've been major beneficiaries by almost any objective standard of the economic interactions that have been fostered by the institutions that the United States helped build over decades. But we have become allergic to those because we blame them for a lot of our domestic problems. And as a result, we're unable to do things like support Taiwan as actively as we could through economic cooperation, because it stands out. We should be including Taiwan in some of those multilateral discussions, because Taiwan has been involved in multilateral cooperation in the past, including being a full member of the WTO, where statehood is not a prerequisite. So I would add that. And then I would just say that one of the additional challenges, in addition to the things that Ryan has mentioned about the coercion, is that China's military modernization has been such that it really puts at risk some of our large forward deployed bases in East Asia in a conflict. So the US military across the various services has tried to move to a more agile, mobile approach for the future to move American forces around. And that will require some coordination with allies. And that's a sensitive issue because our allies and partners don't always fully agree with us on our policy and towards cross-strait relations. But I think it will be an essential part of the deterrence equation as the US supports Taiwan into the future. And the last question was about whether the United States would use force. And when I was in the government and I was asked that on Capitol Hill, I always had the answer that my title is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. There's a lot of adjectives. I will not be making that decision. It's way above my pay grade. But then I would always add, and I meant it, that it would be an enormous mistake for Beijing to underestimate the likelihood of a very robust US military response to an attack on Taiwan. We know, we can say publicly, that the US military thinks hard every day about such contingencies, and we know that PLA thinks hard every day about countering US intervention. So it would be an enormous mistake for them to simply dismiss the possibility that the real person deciding, the president, would not send US forces in Taiwan's defense.
I completely agree with everything that Tom said. I think it's important just to flag, two points that Tom made that are really critical. One is that it's in America's interest, I think, for Taiwan to feel secure, to enjoy prosperity, and to enjoy dignity and respect on the world stage. I think it's also in Australia's interest, Japan's interest, London's interest, Paris's interest for Taiwan to feel that as well. And so that provides a pretty solid foundation for us to work constructively to strengthen Taiwan within the bounds of our own respective one China policies. It's also important for us to listen to what our Taiwan friends say is their most pressing need. And this gets to Tom's point. When you listen to President Tsai and Foreign Minister Wu and others, the top issue that they raise that they want to make progress on with the United States is on trade, on strengthening the economic bonds between the United States and Taiwan, because that's one of the areas where they feel the most vulnerable. And we should heed that and respond to it. And if we can't, move forward a free trade agreement, as looks unlikely given the political dynamics that Tom described, then let's negotiate chapters of what could, through a sum of the parts approach over time, add up to a free trade agreement. But stasis, I don't think, is a viable option for us, and I'm hoping that we can begin to sort of see directional progress soon.
One of the things we're doing on the military front, which I think is right, is we're encouraging Taiwan to adopt ideas that President Tsai seems receptive of, which is to increase Taiwan's own military capabilities in appropriate ways to make it a less attractive target for attack. And we don't have time to go into all the details of that, but that's something the United States can work on with Taiwan. And then finally, and we didn't mention it in this discussion, it's really important to remember that the U.S. deterrence strategy, like all deterrence strategies, has a credible threat of intervention and punishment if the mainland uses force, but it has to be accompanied by assurances that if the mainland doesn't use force, its core political values are not going to be undercut by U.S. policy or Taiwan policy. And that means the U.S. can't be in the business of supporting permanent Taiwan independence from the Chinese nation on a legal basis, because that's almost certainly going to lead to a conflict. So it's not just being strong, it's being strong and smart, and strong and moderate. And in combination, that strategy, that approach has worked. And if you think about, again, we get back to that earlier comments about the region and U.S. policy towards the region, it is extraordinary that we've had 4 decades of conflict-free region when you have very different political systems and you have lots and lots of sensitive, outstanding sovereignty disputes between China and Japan, between mainland China and Taiwan, between China and the Southeast Asian states in the South China Sea, and there hasn't been significant conflict. And that is extraordinary. And we need to understand what we did right and not throw everything out. And sure, we have to make adjustments as China gets stronger. But if we start from the premise that we've been a failure and need to do everything differently, my guess is the next 40 years will not be nearly as peaceful.
So I know we're running up on time for the end of this discussion, but I wanted to sneak in one last question from an alumni of the program, Yinan He from Lehigh University, who touched on the past, successful engagement strategy over the last 40 years and asking what aspects of it do you think are successful and what do you potentially oppose in rethinking of it in light of the current situation that we find ourselves? What aspects of the engagement policy do you think might need to be changed, adjusted, or dropped, if any? If the US were to continue engaging China, in what ways should it be done differently than before, if not from a position of strength?
I'm all for strength. I'm just with Ryan, like, just be strong and don't talk about it. Show up strong. Don't say, I'm here and I'm strong. Just show up strong. They'll notice.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that we're going to have to, over time, become more disciplined in identifying what issues implicate our vital interests and what don't. We had sort of a period of reflexive opposition to everything that China was doing, which was a bit of a pendulum swing in response to, I think, a perception that we just were passive and allowing China to do anything it wanted without us providing any impediment to them from doing so. So it feels like in the past, decade or so, we've occupied both ends of that pendulum swing, and we need to find our way back to the middle somehow. That's, I guess, how I've been thinking about it. I hate the word engagement because it's become such a loaded term. It's become a pejorative term, like, oh, are you an engager or are you, a tough-minded China hawk? And I don't know. I mean, how about we try to be smart and effective in advancing American interests and have effectiveness rather than toughness or weakness be the measure of success or progress. So I'm hoping that as time goes by, we can begin to focus much more so on effectively advancing specific concrete interests and less so on sort of an attitude of strength or weakness as sort of the guidepost of America's conduct with respect to China.
I think we're out of time. I wanted to thank Ryan for a great session. We're really proud of at China in the World that we engage not just scholarly people like Ryan, but people with real policy experience like Ryan, and try to build bridges across those worlds. And I can't think of a session that we've had that exemplifies those goals better than the one we just had. I was really pleased that so many people chimed in and participated in the Q&A, and so many participants listened to the talk, and I hope they benefited from it. And please come back in the future. We've had some of your other policy friends like Susan Thornton here more than once, and we'd love to have you back as well.
Thank you very much. It's been a real privilege for me to be a part of this discussion. I look forward to staying a part of it in the future.
Thank you again to the speaker. And a quick housekeeping note, our next talk will be on October 18th with another alumni of our program, Wendy Luter. We'll be discussing COVID-19 and China's Twitter diplomacy. So we'll enjoy hosting everyone then. And in the meantime, feel free to join us on our newsletter or online anywhere, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much.
Bye, folks.